Support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Oshman Family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Oshman Family JCC is an incubator for new expressions of Jewish identity. It creates innovative Jewish learning, celebrations, and arts programs that inspire personal connections to people and ideas from across the Jewish world. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. This is Judaism Unbound, episode 234, Jews for Racial and Economic Justice. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And as we continue this series on race and Jews and Judaism in America, we are pleased to be able to speak with the executive director of one of a number of organizations in cities across America that are working from a Jewish point of view for justice for the entire society. Our guest today is Audrey Sasson. She is the executive director of Jews for Racial and Economic Justice, which is an organization that, in their words, is a home for Jewish New Yorkers to organize with our neighbors and allies for a New York where everyone has the freedom and opportunity to thrive. Jews for Racial and Economic Justice, or JFREJ, is one of a number of groups in cities across the United States that are devoted to, as they put it, transforming the city we love from a playground for the wealthy few into a democracy for all of us, and to fight and undo oppressive systems and actors that target, harm, and displace our communities. Audrey Sasson is the first Mizrahi leader to serve as the organization's executive director. For those who don't know, Mizrahi Jews are, roughly speaking, Jews who trace their ancestry over the last 1,000 or so years to what we think of as the Middle East and North Africa. And she is an active member of JFREJ's Mizrahi Caucus. Audrey Sasson has close to 20 years of broad movement experience as a social worker, organizer, coalition builder, and campaign director on issues ranging from immigrant worker struggles and tenant rights to sustainable economies and racial justice. Audrey Sasson previously served for 7 years on the staff at American Jewish World Service and worked with organized labor, most recently as director of Walmart Free NYC. Before becoming executive director of JFREJ, she served on the board of directors for 6 years, including as board chair. Audrey Sasson, welcome to Judaism Unbound. It's so great to have you.
Thanks for having me.
Well, it feels like a lot of what we're talking about in this series and a lot of what's going on in America today kind of puts JFREJ, Jews for Racial and Economic Justice, in the center of what we ought to be talking about. So we're really excited about this episode and really interested in understanding what JFREJ is doing now and also how it was established, what's its history. So could you take us all the way back to the beginning and give us a little bit of a brief tour about why was it established and when and what's it up to now?
JFREJ was established 30 years ago, so quite precisely 1990. So we're in our 30th year. And we were established by a group of organizers and activists who were living and organizing in New York, Jewish organizers who had a vision around what it would look like for Jews to be more actively involved in justice struggles in the city of New York, for a more just New York specifically, who could show up as Jews, but in coalition with wider movements for justice. The original coalition of Jews who came together for JFREJ were really rooted in Doikite, which is a Yiddish term I can get into in a minute. But, they had a vision of doing justice work where you live. And so in 1990, that meant they were, engaging in fights around housing and labor and anything that had to do with what makes New York both a wonderful city and a difficult city to live in. And at the same time that they were starting to organize, Nelson Mandela was released from prison. And he was going on a tour of the entire world to celebrate his release and the victory of the anti-apartheid movement. Of course, to those of our founders, he was a hero and someone that we, was well deserving of great honor. But it was also the case that the established Jewish community was actually not remotely interested in honoring Mandela upon his arrival in New York. That prompted the group that was forming, that was nascent, that was there, that already had a vision to really have its first public event, which was to honor Mandela and to bring together folks, including Harry Belafonte and others, and Rabbi Marshall Meyer, many luminaries and others who were involved in justice work to come together and say, as Jews, we do stand with you, Nelson Mandela. The reason he was snubbed, so to speak, from the establishment was because of his relationship to Palestine. And for me, I came into this work as a board member in 2011, and I was really active in the years that Black Lives Matter emerged on the scene. And what we saw then in 2014, 2015 was a similar reaction from the Jewish community that we had seen, 25 years earlier, which was people doing justice work for the freedom and liberation of all people and for the fight against anti-Blackness were not welcome in our community because of the solidarity that was expressed with Palestinians. So in some ways, JFREJ is an incredibly local organization focused on local fights, but with a real internationalist vision that all of our struggles are connected.
So if you could describe, in a sense, the mission, the philosophy, the point of view that JFREJ takes today, and particularly this question of the racial and economic justice. I mean, are those, and I don't mean this as a leading question because I actually am curious about how the two are woven together, not only in reality, but also in how the organization thinks of them. How do you think about the connections between racial justice and economic justice and Jews? How do those three weave together?
We think of our fight as a fight against racial capitalism. I mean, if you want to look to the source of the problem, we have racial capitalism, which at its root exploits labor, and that labor in particular is Black and brown labor, and that those things are connected. And cannot, in order for the wealthy few to hold on to the power that they hold on to, that is what they need in order to thrive and to continue to live their best life while everyone else struggles at the bottom of the ladder. And so that's very clear to us as what we're confronting. And so it's always important for us to connect those dots. One very clear example of this is the fight for the budget in New York City, right? We had a budget fight, which in some ways was an economic justice fight, that prior to the protests that erupted in May, June across the country, here in New York, we were already engaged in a fight with our coalition partners, with Communities United for Police Reform, to say, hey, we're in a global pandemic. We're also facing a looming recession. The people who are most going to be impacted and struggle the most and who are disproportionately impacted by COVID to begin with, in terms of health disparities and also in terms of the economic impact, are disproportionately Black and brown folks. And we are saying that we're going to slash all of the social services while maintaining the NYPD $6 billion budget intact. There is something inherently unjust, obviously, about that entire setup, and those things are connected. We need to move and divest money from the NYPD and into the services that are going to help our communities thrive. That was an economic justice fight, and it was a racial justice fight together, and we can't separate those. I think also we've done at JFREJ, we have two core campaigns, and those campaigns also could be seen as, and they're longstanding. We believe in this work as sort of longstanding, long-term work, that you have to be in it and really build trust over time and really build your vision and build power, and that none of that happens overnight. So for many years, we've been working on a campaign called the Caring Majority. Some people would think of that as squarely an economic justice campaign. It's a campaign to bring just economy and to our elders and the most vulnerable among us, and to ensure that they have access to universal long-term care as they age, and that they can age in place with dignity, and that the jobs that are care jobs are dignified jobs. And so that has always been sort of, some people think of that as our economic justice campaign. But the jobs are mostly held by women of color and immigrant women. And so it's critical that we don't sort of separate that out. Same with, as I said, like the policing campaign is both an economic justice fight and a racial justice fight.
So I'm going to throw out a term that has helped me a lot as an activist and honestly also as a Jew in various ways, which is the term movement ecology. The term movement ecology, for those who haven't heard it before, listeners out there, hey, I was one of you not too long ago. I'd never heard this term. Basically, it's, this idea that there's lots of different kinds of organizations working towards shared goals, and they sort of fill different kinds of niches, almost in like an ecological sense, like the way that ecology works with, animals and living things. So situate us movement ecology wise. Like JFREJ comes up in a lot of conversations when I'm talking to folks from just general activist movements that like might not be Jewish at all. It comes up when I'm talking to people involved with Jewish organizations that might not always be so directly focused on justice. Not that they're like anti-justice, but just like they do other things. It comes up in all sorts of realms. And I think sometimes people have heard of JFREG many times, but might not know exactly like, okay, where does it place itself with respect to sort of broader activist movements? Where does it place itself with respect to Jewish movements? Where all of that. And given, I want to name this specifically, given that we're in a unit of amazing conversations with a whole slew of different kinds of organizations, I'm sitting here nervous that people will listen to all of them and be like, oh, I heard some cool conversations, but I can't remember which is which. And I want to name that some of the organizations really are specifically for us, by us Jews of color organizations, where if you're not a Jew of color, you can of course support, but you're not somebody who is part of that organization. Jews for Racial and Economic Justice has many white Jews who are part of it in different ways, but it also has many Jews of color. So I'd love for you to help us just understand, like, who are we talking about when we talk about JFREG, and in what ways is it relating to these other realms of justice orgs, Jewish orgs, etc.?
First of all, the ecosystem changes all the time, and something that you learn as a an internationalist, a socialist, that conditions matter. So I would say that JFREG over time has played a different role in that movement ecology, and that right now is a really fascinating moment for JFREG in that ecology. Certainly at the beginning when we were first established, which we were established largely majority by Ashkenazi white Jews, who were really rooted in our Yiddishkeit, our Doigkeit, orientation. Doigkeit means here-ness in Yiddish. And it is a term that was really embraced by, maybe coined by the Jewish Labor Bund in Eastern Europe, and that it was about identifying for Jews that liberation will come from seeking kinship with our neighbors wherever we live and fighting for justice wherever we are. And importantly, that there's no justice just for Jews, just as there's no justice that erases us. And so we need to be able to show up in our full selves and be fully Jewish at the same time that we recognize our shared stake in solidarity with all communities. I get chills every time I think about that. To me, that is the reason I have been so drawn to JFREG over the years, and what that has been the sort of anchor, the linchpin for so many people who come to JFREG, and they find that and they're like, oh my gosh, I've been taught so many other things about what it means to be Jewish and my role in the Jewish community, and it's never been described exactly like this, and yet it really resonates for me. So we've been able to tap into that, and that feeling, I think, amongst Jews, in New York. So we're very focused on New York. We think of ourselves as locally, we organize locally with a lot of reach, across the country and relationships across the country and internationally. But that it's really important to root your struggle in your local conditions. And so that's, so for that reason, it's a philosophy. Sometimes people say, why don't you come and bring a JFREG to the Bay Area? We'd love JFREG to come here. And we're always like, no, what are your local conditions? You have to organize yourselves. We're happy to be thought partners and be in relationship with you. We've been approached just since I've been in this role since 2017. I started when Trump became president. And I was on the board.
What did you do to deserve that?
I know, for real. Honestly, I don't know. When I was interviewing for the role, that was not the case. I got the job offer on election day, and I started the week of the inauguration. It was a trick. But in these last 3.5 years, we've really seen, a shift in the way our community wrestles with and engages with these conditions. And what does it mean to be Jewish in America? And what is our role in these fights for justice? And we've been approached by mainstream organizations which 30 years ago would have said, you're, treif as in unkosher. And today, when we speak with these, non-Jewish organizations out there in New York, they keep telling us that the only Jews they know are from JFREG. What's the thing that you do? How do you do that? How do you have trust? How do you build that relationship? And we have to explain, well, we do it through longstanding relationships, which means that over time we build that trust, and we also don't run away when things get hard. And that's something that, our community really needs, I think, to wrestle with more and more as polarization gets deeper and deeper, and Jews in the center are trying to figure out their place. So we're in a very different place in the ecology today within the Jewish community than we would have been 30 years ago. And I'd say because for 30 years we have been building that trust, we're also in New York, I think, highly regarded within the grassroots movement spaces because we've been in coalition for so many years, and we haven't run away when things have been difficult. When the Movement for Black Lives dropped their platform in 2016, JFridge was already organizing our base and our members, and Jews of color, Black Jews in particular, were leading this fight to support Black Lives Matter. We were on the fourth week of a weekly action, and we were escalating, and we were really in it, and we were led by our own community members who were saying like, hey, we're being murdered by the police, hello, So we were agitated, we were in the streets, and the platform dropped, and within, as many people remember, within 24 hours, every Jewish institution, including some progressive organizations, felt the need to say something, because the Movement for Black Lives had a platform that spoke on the question of Palestine in a way that was very uncomfortable for folks in our community, for some folks in our community. And for us, that was a moment of real, like, what are we doing? We're going back in the streets. We're going to continue to take action. We're not running away from this fight. So so that's what we have to explain to folks when they come to us. And it took more people dying, which we should all be outraged about, being murdered, right? So we're in a moment of reckoning in our community.
I want to bring up another core piece of, maybe not another, I want to bring up a piece of JFridge's core programming that actually, it's not, I'm saying not another because it's come up already in certain ways, but implicitly. I think for a lot of people, and I include myself in this, I sort of mentally compartmentalize organizations. And I'm like, there's these organizations that do like justice or repair the world kinds of things from a Jewish lens, Tikkun Olam type stuff, all those things. And then there's a different set of organizations that do like, I don't know, peoplehood, inward look, like looking out for anti-Semitism, that kind of stuff. But what I have really grown to understand, largely because of the work of JFridge, is that you can be that repair the world justice organization and be a leader in the realm of looking at anti-Semitism. And building people's understanding of not only how Jews who are white Jews can look at the intersection of a race that is not their own, how Jews who are whatever intersection of class can think about those who are not economically well off, but also how Jews can do a better job of conceptualizing what anti-Semitism is and isn't. What does it look like to do that work from JFridge's standpoint? What are some of the layers of challenge there that come up in doing work to combat anti-Semitism, to educate around anti-Semitism? And what does it look like recently? And how, maybe for some of us here talking to you or listening, how might JFridge offer a lens on anti-Semitism that is different from how we were shaped to understand it?
The resurgence of our organizing and research and analysis work around anti-Semitism that we started back in maybe I want to say 2015, 2016, in some ways coincided with that time in our evolution recently, where we also were establishing caucuses, right? We have a Mizrahi caucus, we were establishing the Jews of Color caucus, and also a Raised Poor and Working Class caucus. And it was in examining our own internal intersectionalities that we also were wrestling with this question of anti-Semitism and how does that land and how do people experience that? So that, that's not coincidental that all of those things kind of lined up. The sort of, I'd say, strategic / organizing principle behind our anti-Semitism work has been based on the realization at a certain point that our movement partners, not Jewish movement partners, had some blind spots around it. And so, we were sort of noticing that was getting in the way sometimes. It wasn't that we thought that they were out to get us. It just was that there were things that would be said or spoken. And we're trying to fight capitalism. And what's the big, the best boogeyman for capitalism if you don't know, if you haven't, if we haven't talked about anti-Semitism in the movement left for 20, 30 years in America. It used to be very central to the conversations of building the left and a progressive vision, because you need to in Europe, it's a different conversation altogether, because there's an understanding of the sort of role that anti-Semitism plays in upholding white supremacy and in upholding capitalism. It's functional. It's super functional. And so when you can see that, then you don't get confused about your landlord or your boss being, if they're Jewish, but mostly they're a landlord or a boss. And so keep your eye on the prize of what it is that we're trying to confront and undo and dismantle. But when you live in New York, largest population of Jews in the country and, deep economic inequality. There were things that would prop up and we were like, this is getting in the way. We need to better understand anti-Semitism. We need to understand it. And we realized that we have completely ceded that conversation to the Jewish right. And so what that means is that if people talk about anti-Semitism, they think that what we're saying is an attack on Israel, and and they're afraid to speak on it. And everyone in the leftist assumes that if you're saying something's anti-Semitic, it's because you're afraid of critique of Israel. All of that was not helping us. And so we decided to dig in, and we did collective research. We're a membership-based organization. So members who were interested in this subject, joined a working group, and we did a ton of research to dig into the history of understanding how anti-Semitism plays a role. And we didn't land it, but what we did was we at least created this offering, in 2017 after 2 years of research, which was this 44-page paper, really a labor of love by the JFridge community to be like, hey, movement partners, here's what anti-Semitism is. It is real. It is dangerous to Jews and also to our movement. And there's a long history of the powers, that be using it to divide us, and we need to look out for it. That was our strategy in developing that. And it's since become a real resource for the left. And so much has happened since then, I think really hearteningly, within spaces that, are trying to wrestle with an understanding of how it's playing out.
So you mentioned earlier that there are various caucuses within JFridge, that there's the Jews of Color caucus, and there's the Mizrahi caucus, and economic disadvantage caucus. I don't remember all the terminology they used. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what that's for. What are the goals of those caucuses? Because I'm thinking in my mind that when it feels like the way that you're describing it and the way that I kind of understand it, that in the 90s, when you're talking about, Jews for racial and economic justice, you tend to be talking about a group of white Jews, Ashkenazi Jews who are lefties, and they really want to, do right in the world and change the economic system, and they're socialists and all that kind of thing, and now you kind of have all these conversations, which we're having in these weeks on the podcast, about the need for racial and economic justice within the Jewish community, that there's all these Jews of color who are not being welcomed into the Jewish community, or not properly, or afraid, there's security outside synagogues and are being racially profiled and all these kinds of things. And so there's now at least two objectives. One is to make the Jewish community more what we wish the whole world would have been. And we kind of, I think those white Jews, well, they probably didn't love all the Jewish institutions, but they kind of weren't seeing that as the major problem that they were fighting. And yet we hear from a lot of Jews of color today that that is one of the major problems that they're concerned about. And if we're not going to find our place within the Jewish community, well, the easiest thing, like any of us who don't find our place in the Jewish community for whatever reason, is to go find our place somewhere else. And at the same time, there's also this massive coalition to work on the racial and economic justice of America and of the world, which clearly at this moment that we're in right now, whether both the Trump administration and COVID, there's a lot of energy there. There's a lot of need there, and there's a lot of need for a coalition. So I'm wondering how, I'm overwhelmed just talking it through. How do you think about actually what you do day to day?
When we started the caucuses, it was because we had members of JFridge who did identify from those constituencies, so to speak, and were looking for other folks, and they agitated internally. So that happened with us, I guess maybe sooner than it happened in other parts of the community, but it came from that agitation. I was actually a Mizrahi member of the board of directors, and I was like, I'm here because I love the history of JFridge. I love the lineage that it comes from. I feel really, honored to be part of a community that's building off of that, Bundist history. I wasn't seeking my Mizrahi, progressive credentials or looking for other Mizrahi Jews who felt similarly. I wasn't looking for it. And then, a member said, I want to start a caucus of Mizrahim. And I was like, why? And I think when I look back, I tell this story often because I didn't even know I needed it until she created the space. For many folks who come to JFridge for the political organizing work, they might not look for that. They might not be needing that. But then once you create that space in a container that is building a political home and a political project, then what emerges from that is so much more transformative. So now we have a Mizrahi caucus that can engage on certain questions around colonialism, wrestling with passing perhaps, or having light skin privilege, but being Arab, or, in other ways, sort of holding a different identity within the community. And what does that mean for what kind of transformational politic we want to hold? And we just have a much richer analysis now, because there is a thriving Mizrahi caucus that has been digging into our history and into our, into our relationship to the Middle East, which includes Israel and Palestine, right? So that that complicates things in really interesting ways. So we're just much stronger and richer as an organization because we have those members that are digging into those questions. For people of color, for Jews of color who, there's an overlap, there's a Venn diagram between Mizrahi Jews and POC Jews. And for the Jews of color caucus, a different thing was necessary. There was literally, Mizrahi Jews would never be questioned on their Jewishness, right? So what we were questioned on more often than not would be our politics, because there's an assumption and an understanding that Mizrahim are more conservative. For Jews of color, and so now that I know that there's a whole community of radical Mizrahi Jews that are participating in JFREJ, my life has changed, and I'm very grateful for it. Oftentimes I think the biggest concern and challenge that we've seen in our established organizations is that Jews of color just simply don't feel welcome, period. Their identity is questioned. So for us, it was important that each caucus defined for itself what it wanted to explore and why it wanted to exist, and why JFREJ. And the question of why JFREJ changed over time. It was sort of like, for some people, because there was such a dearth of spaces for these communities to come together, I would say that for some people looking for the Jews of color caucus at JFREJ, they just wanted that space, that affinity space. And it provided a lot of incubation of ideas and relationships, and really important things came out of it. But then the question that we had to also ask ourselves is, are we building, what is the relationship between affinity spaces and the multiracial spaces that we're trying to build more broadly? And how do we integrate that in a way that has integrity and is taking its cues and its lead from those members, at the same time that we're clear that we're here to do this organizing? That's a conversation that's ongoing.
To get even into some of the real specifics of the how and the strategy, I feel like there's an unspoken big question tactically about how Judaism or Jewish tradition plays into activism that we don't always address head on. But I think there's actually historically and now really different orientations to the question of, should we be starting ourselves or our activism from a place of, Jewish tradition compels me to do X? There's Passover coming up, it's not coming up now, but as an example, Passover's coming up. Passover is a story all about liberation from slavery. That's an easy entry into conversations of more recent institutions of slavery, even contemporary institutions of slavery. We could talk about mass incarceration, all of that. And then there's also other activist movements, including, in my view, deeply Jewish activist movements, who have decidedly not done that, who have decidedly not done the thing of, it's Passover. They've just said, okay, I'm Jewish. That may influence my family story, that may influence who I am. But when I show up in the streets, I'm not going to have the Hebrew sign. I'm going to show up because this is the thing to do as a human. And I feel like we don't always talk about that tension. And from my perspective as an outsider to JFREJ, my sense, and this, if I'm wrong about this, tell me I'm wrong about this. My sense is that JFREJ is part of a group of many organizations where the extent to which the first one, the Jewish tradition, the holidays, all of that, the extent to which that is front and center in organizing has increased recently. And I think of, in the movement of college, things like If Not Now, Never Again Action, who have really explicitly centered Jewish holidays, Jewish traditions, I feel like are part of that whole wave. But I'm interested in opening that up because, especially in New York, there's plenty of secularists out there. And I think there's people who don't always feel fully represented by that. And I think that it's a tension worth unraveling and discussing. How do you go about the conversations of, okay, Passover's coming up. We can do our Haggadah. There's beautiful resources that you've created for, that JFREJ has created for lots of Jewish traditions, holidays, etc. But how does that all work? And are there tensions there?
Yeah, this is another example of something that has changed a lot over time. To think that the question actually is framed in such a way that maybe secularists feel a little bit like, wait, what about me? Is just interesting because 5 years ago, or what, even 10, it would have been the other way around.
Right.
So what is it that, when I moved here and I from Canada and I met like people in my generation who were observant but sort of in the modern world observant in a way that I just hadn't encountered. Like I thought they were observant in the way my grandparents might have been. And I thought, and that had been sort of shed over time. I met all these young people who were really embracing their Jewish observance in an entirely different way than I'd ever seen. And JFridge had to reckon with that too. We were like, are we in welcoming space? Like we're so rooted in our Yiddishkeit and in our secularism, and we need to really examine that. And so we expanded our sort of, our way of thinking and talking about our work to be far, to have it shaped by the very many different access points that our community has to our tradition. We've created more and more space, one, for Mizrahi Jews to participate differently, and so that every event does not only have a nigun that's a Yiddish nigun, but has some kind of Middle Eastern music also, accompanying it. That has shifted the way people think about Jewish culture. And in terms of ritual, it's also, open for anything from, if you're secular, you can do it this way. And if you're observant, we have developed this resource as well. And we can't do all of it. But I think that it's a strength of our community that there's, diasporism calls on us at JFridge to really be grounded in the very many ways in which people can express their Judaism. And so I think that that's what's important to us. And doing the work of creating that space is not easy, but I think the goal is that secular to observant, Mizrahi and Ashkenazi, Black and brown. And I would also say this question of, I would say that I spent 7 years working in the Jewish social justice world before I started working at JFridge at an American Jewish World Service. And I met a lot, I sort of was involved with a lot of the sort of educational materials creation that tried to connect our Torah tradition and our Talmud tradition to Jewish values. And for me, at a certain point, I got a little bit like, well, are we trying too hard to connect the dots here? Does it matter? Like, what if our tradition is actually pretty complicated and doesn't have a single North Star that tells us how to be a good person? It has complicated conversations about it, but some of it's a bit messed up, maybe. I don't know. I'm allowed to still be deeply Jewish and accept that some of it's not actually directing me to make the world a better place. And I'm fine with that. And the world that the world that I'm excited to build is one where we get to be fully ourselves in all of our messiness. And we don't have to have a prescriptive Judaism that tells us to do X, Y, Z. Some of our Jewish resources and scripture and all of the sacred texts and some of our Jewish history in terms of our storytelling and our histories does point us in that direction. Some of it, not so much.
Can you say a little bit more about what you mean when you talk about diasporism?
I would love to. Our first executive director, Melanie K. Kantrowitz, may she rest in peace, who passed away 2 years ago, she coined a term, radical diasporism. And for her, it was this idea that the Jewish people is a diasporic people. We are from all over the world. We might not have a single homeland, actually. So that's a little agitational and tricky in today's contemporary Jewish world. But I love the question it asks us to engage with. What is even our connection to land? What is home? And she really forced us to wrestle with what are borders and how can we transcend borders? The borders of the mind, physical borders, right? And I think what she called on us to do is to really explore that in a really profound way so that you can really seek kinship with you are an other, they are, everyone is another. And there's no way for us to build a beautiful world of interdependence if we're not actually in relationship with everybody. And so it's sort of a counter to the idea that nationalism is something that can save us. And I say that really intellectually on some level, but of course it has material implications. I would say that, at a certain level, we orient towards this idea that nationalism is in and of itself exclusionary. It means you have to define who the nation is, and then you create political nationalism, creates boundaries around that. In this world, this day and age, it's hard to imagine a different way of trying to organize ourselves. But is that liberatory? So radical diasporism is the idea that, where you are is your home, your neighbors are the people you see kinship with, and it is where you struggle for justice. So for us, that's New York.
So I'm really excited by this because as far as I can remember, we haven't talked a ton about diasporism on the podcast, but for me, it looms very large in my own conception of Jewish and Doikite too. Doikite being that word for here-ness. The first time I saw it, I was just like deeply touched. It wasn't that, I learned this term only a few years ago from, I don't know if it was first from Jewish Currents, but Jacob Plittman wrote a beautiful piece when Jewish Currents, the publication, sort of was starting its recent effort to just drastically expand what it is as a project. There was this beautiful piece that Jacob Plittman wrote about what it is to be a diasporist. And so I want to talk about that from a few angles. One, I'm going to tell like a joke that's not a joke. When Jews in North Carolina start a project for justice, they call it Carolina Jews for Justice. Logical. When Jews in Detroit start a project working towards justice, they call it Detroit Jews for Justice. When Jews in New York start something for justice, they call it Jews for Racial and Economic Justice. They don't say New York Jews for Racial and Economic Justice, which I'm saying it as a joke, and I know that it wasn't that they were trying, but like there's a way in which New York centers itself in the story such that you don't even need to say New York when you're talking about New York Jews. I say that as somebody with love for New York Jews. Both of my parents are New York Jews, even though I grew up in Milwaukee. I'm not saying that to like disparage the organization or New York Jews, but I think there's something there because there's a question, right, between whether the project is like sort of an alternate homeland. Like there's people who joke about or are serious about New York as like an alternate Jewish homeland. And there's truth to that. It's a huge Jewish community. The biggest in the world for one city. And also, from my perspective, there's a huge tension there because I sometimes feel like diasporism has this way in which we talk about New York history and we don't learn the here-nesses of our own cities elsewhere. And so my question on the here-ness front is like, how should we actually do it? Like, if we're taking this project seriously of diasporism, of any land is homeland, of Thor Ragnarok's conclusion that Asgard is wherever we are, not the place Asgard. Sorry, I have to make a Marvel Cinematic shout out here. What do we do with diasporism? And like, are there ways in which as a New York organization, you're kind of straddling this place where you're both a local organization and you're kind of a diaspora, like you're kind of more than that too?
We have received many, requests like, bring a J Fridge to the Bay Area, right? And I've said, that's not what we do. It has to be the local conditions. The naming is an interesting point.
It's mostly a joke, but
it's really fun. I really think because there's something to it. It took me a minute when I was in the Bay Area and I was like, why is there no Bay Area Jews for Justice, right? Like, I mean, there are groups but like the one that they're looking, some of the people have asked me to think through with them. There's no DJJ or CJJ in the Bay Area, Detroit Jews for Justice, Carolina Jews for Justice. And we talked a little bit about the differences in the New York Jewish community and the Bay Area Jewish community. And I learned a little bit more about, tendencies or history of the Jewish community in the Bay Area. And it prompted me or forced me to kind of reckon with what makes the New York Jewish community the New York Jewish community. What is it about it that has us really both like rooted in our Jewish history and then and also really focused on New York. And it was this immigrant story that we actually, as Jews in New York, really, I think, I'm an immigrant in New York, but the immigrant experience in New York has helped New York Jews really hold on to their Jewishness at the same time that they're also New Yorkers, right? And I don't know if I'm it's just a sort of way to say that I think every city has its own character. And you're right to point out that the New York Jewish community is also very particular. It takes up more space in the national consciousness than CJJ or DJJ would. I mean, it's so many things. It's so many questions of power and what does power mean? And like, what does it mean that, for me, I think what I take away from it often is given the disproportionate number of Jewish people living in New York, what is our responsibility, given the reach that we have nationally, given that like we have a different kind of responsibility to do the justice work that we do, because it has a different impact. So it's about the ripple effect. It's like we are still very rooted here, but we know that the impact of Jewish New Yorkers taking action in coalition with others is different. And so it's important for us to own that power in some ways, right? And to really wrestle with that.
I've said this before that I think for a lot of white people, in particular, a lot of white Jews, one of the horrors of COVID is this realization that, if the hospitals are full, then I might get sick and die when I could have been cured. And, my response to that, well, that's what everybody's been going through all the time that didn't have health insurance. And I actually think that over the last 4 months, there seems to have been a greater openness to that. I think that the polling on Black Lives Matter is remarkable, given the history of where this country's been and the support for it. And I guess I'm wondering whether, to the extent that this whole situation and maybe the combination of Black Lives Matter and the murders at the hands of police and also COVID, has done something, has shaken something loose, and that there's kind of a moment of possibility. And yet there's also this kind of fixed thinking that says, hey, if you're going to talk about diasporism, then, there's some kind of anti-Semitism because you're anti-Israel, and if you're going to talk about post-capitalistic, whatever, then that's like un-American because you're anti-democracy, and I guess I'm curious if you can give us, how do you respond to those kinds of questions? Because it feels like there's an opportunity here where an organization like JFREG, would have been like, and you were talking about it earlier, might have been seen in the past as kind of, a bit on the margins, actually now a little bit closer in than it was before. But there's actually a possibility now, I think, for people to be really listening. And yet for activists, that's sometimes hard because it means that we can't, or if we do use some of the kinds of language that we might use with the people who already agree with us, we're going to potentially drive those folks away, and it becomes a kind of a dance. So I'm curious how you've been navigating that.
I'm certainly someone who falls into that trap. I struggle with that. But, there's strategic ways to communicate. But I think it's not even just about the communication. I think it's not that JFREG is being pulled to the center, right? It's that the center is being pulled left. And that's a very it's a scary thing. I think for anyone to sort of feel like the ground beneath them is shifting, it is an opportunity to, with compassion and love and care, like we're all in a great crisis right now. Everybody is struggling, right? And so there is no shame. There's no time or space for that kind of approach. What does make the last 6 months, especially agitational is the life and death stakes of it. It's literally life and death on every front. And we're fighting a war on two fronts. And, COVID on the one hand and the Black Lives Matter fight on the other. And in both cases, people are dying. And it's people close to us. And we always say those closest to the pain are closest to the solution, right? And that any attempt to build a more just world has to start with centering those experiences so that we can actually I don't think white folks have the imagination. We cannot actually imagine what comes after this in some ways because we haven't been developing the muscle of resistance and resilience in the same way that Black people in this country for 400 years have been resisting and being resilient. This is a moment to really listen to the communities closest to the pain. And if JFREG can play some part humbly in creating that space for people to listen, then maybe we can actually imagine something that comes after this. Our opportunity is to recognize the ways in which our economic system, the lack of healthcare, the lack of any kind of safety net at a time when the entire world is in this crisis, coincides with this entirely not new exposure of the systematized police brutality in this country. It's an opportunity to say, what are the connections here, and what does it look like to build a community and a society in which everyone has the freedom and opportunity to thrive. This virus has exposed how we are entirely interdependent, whether we like it or not, and so we have to come up with a better system. Whether you say I'm an anti-capitalist or I'm a socialist, doesn't matter. We just know that this is broken.
As we get towards the close of our time, I want to come back to the question of anti-Semitism, because I find it to be one that gets raised and thrown at me in a sense with, certain people I know of let's say older generations, not exclusively, but a lot of that. When we're looking at things like Black Lives Matter, and when those of us who say, as a Jew, I feel a strong demand to be part of this, whether that's because of Jewish values and Jewish things in our text that I do find strong. And, I just have a tendency to throw out the stuff that I don't want, and that I'm willing to move forward, with the coalition of the willing, with the good stuff. But there's that, or also, things from our history or whatever reason that you want to say as a Jew, I feel called to be on the barricades here. And then you hear, but why aren't we on the barricades in the same way when people do anti-Semitic things? But then something happens where, the real thing that's I think difficult for a lot of people is, what do we do when some of the folks in leadership or in positions of honor, let's say in the Black community in this case, either say things that themselves may be anti-Semitic, or in the case of someone like Farrakhan, fail to distance themselves sufficiently from someone who clearly is anti-Semitic. And then it kind of has this tendency to shut down the whole ability of a lot of Jews to really embrace something that I think they truly actually believe in. And I'm wondering if, maybe from being out in the field there, you have some advice for me and for others about how do we talk to our fellow Jews where we kind of don't dismiss it. I think sometimes I have a tendency to be overly dismissive and just say, it's not the same, come on, but at the same time, that the goal, that the result needs to be that Jews are fighting this fight.
Yes. The many hours I've spent on this question since being in this role. It's painful, it's complicated on some level, and it's also not on some level. So, it is layered. I would say one of the ways I might respond is just to sort of think about, it's never to dismiss anti-Semitism. It's never okay. And it's trying to understand the context. In the context we are in, right, where white nationalism is on the rise, I am certainly concerned, very much so for my life and well-being, that those who are seeking power want to divide us, and they want to build a country just for themselves. And that does not include us. It doesn't include Black people or Jews of color. To me, what that shows is that it is a tool. It is very much a tool. So we know it's a tool. We know it is used to confuse and distract people from what are the real, actual levers of power. So when it happens in our movements, it is 100%, it can be painful and confusing, and I completely understand and validate that. And I think there's a lot of difference also between, Ilhan Omar and someone like a Farrakhan. Ilhan Omar is an elected representative to Congress, and she is a woman of color, and she is a powerful Muslim leader. When she says something that is problematic, and then, you're like, okay, well, what is her project? What is she trying to do? Do we think she's trying to actually harm the Jewish people? I'm like, I don't think she is. So I want to just take a minute and understand what it was that she said and what context in which she said it. Now, when someone who is not part of a progressive movement, and I would say, it's really complicated. And I don't want to speak, in some ways it's hard for people who aren't, I think, Farrakhan is an anti-Semite. He's an anti-Semite, and he's also not a progressive. I'm not in it with Farrakhan. And I'm also clear that people that I am in relationship with have a complicated history with the Nation of Islam. I need to explore that and understand that. It doesn't mean you give a pass. It just means that you try to get in it, right? You try to be like, what is this about? Why would you say such a thing? It's I always ask this question. As part of a community that is 2% of the population of the United States, that is of course, scapegoated often. Of course, we are under there is a threat to us. There is a threat. There's always a threat to Jews. But what is our option to align ourselves with the powerful and assume that they'll protect us? We know the history. So it's I know what side of history I want to be on, and that means I'm going to struggle with the people who are trying to find their way in a world that has been muddied by all of these intersecting, oppressions, racism, anti-Semitism, and xenophobia, and they're all intersecting. just find your people, talk to them, wrestle with it, but know that it is anti-Semitism as a tool. It is a tool. We're positioned as the ones with power. And so people who are legit struggling, who have real frustrations. If you're Black in America, I'm sorry, I can't remotely relate. I have no idea what it is that you're struggling with and what you're holding on your back. Until there's freedom and liberation for Black people, there's probably going to be some toxic spaces where some things come up, and we just got to be, ready to wrestle with that.
What is most important for people listening to this episode to walk away with as they go to whatever is coming next after they, turn off their phone, which is playing this episode?
I think something I go back to often is that there's actually no going back to the way things were before. The center isn't holding, and that's true both in the Jewish community and in this country as a whole. There is a reckoning that is long overdue. I don't believe history naturally progresses towards good. I love the idea, but we know that it's cyclical also. And we know that, it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back, and steps along, laterally. That said, I do think that we are in a moment where the last 30, 40 years have really just pillaged everything in terms of what is decent and right and whatever we had remotely tried to build, right? So it's sort of like we have centuries of slavery to reckon with and the genocide of the indigenous communities here in this country. We have, an economic system that has entirely, like I said, pillaged the wealth of this country, mostly pillaged the wealth of Black and brown people. And and Jews are not going to be safe by just trying to cling to power. That our safety comes through solidarity. If you're afraid right now, fear is it is a distorting emotion. And so I think Jews are understandably afraid. A lot of communities are afraid right now. We choose solidarity over fear every single time. That is our sort of approach to this work, and that we know it's going to take a long time, but at the very least, we know that when that flag goes up, when you're like, I'm a little nervous again, think about what it could look like to actually release that fear. And to us, that's sort of the way that we want to think about building a caring economy and a world where everyone has the freedom to thrive.
Thank you so much, Audrey, for joining us. This has been a fantastic conversation.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
And thanks so much to all of you out there listening. We hope you've enjoyed this episode, and we hope that you'll tune in again in the future. We want to close out this episode in the same way that we always do, by encouraging you to be in touch with us, and there are a wide variety of ways for you to do that. First, you can head to our Facebook pages, either one of them. They're at Judaism Unbound or Jewish Live. That's just all one word on Jewish Live. You can head to our Twitter feed, which is at Judaism Unbound. You can check out our new Instagram, also Judaism Unbound. You can go to our website, judaismunbound.com or jewishlive.org. And last but not least, you can email us at dan@judaismunbound.com or lex@judaismunbound.com. The last request we like to make is that we deeply appreciate any amount of financial donation that you can send our way, and you can do that at judaismunbound.com/donate on either a monthly recurring basis or just as a one-time gift. So thanks so much for listening, and with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.